My name's James Bonas. I am the director of a new play called UnRavelled by Jake Broder. And if you want to know more about it, listen to this podcast.
Talking about Jake. When did you first hear about the play Unraveled?
I first heard about UnRavelled when I was actually doing a performance of, I made with a group of people, a production of L'Enfant les Sortilèges, which is a Ravel opera, a one-act opera. And we did it with the National Opera de Lyon about 10 years ago. And I was working with an animator, Grégoire Pont, French guy. We were working together on this production, and it did really well. And then it's toured all over the world, really, in loads of different places. And one of the places it went to was San Francisco Symphony. And so we were doing a production of it there. And Jake was up in San Francisco with the GBHI, the Global Brain Health Institute, during his fellowship year. He didn't know I'd done it. Jake and I have known each other since I was 19 or 20, for a long time. I didn't know who was in town. He didn't know I'd made the show. He just went along to watch it because someone said, "Oh, there's a Ravel piece, you should watch it." And then he saw my name in the program and laughed a lot, and he really liked the show. Anyway, so then we had a drink after, and because he messaged me, and he told me of the sort of serendipity of the fact that he was just starting to engage with writing this piece, exploring these ideas about the potential for the play, and it started there, really.
What is unique about playwright Jake Broder's writing, and why did you want to work with him on this project?
So I wanted to work with Jake on the project because I'm always very interested in new writing and creating new works of theatre or dance or opera, because I think those are that's the only way our art form will survive. It's no good just recycling things. You can do brilliant productions of prior stuff. There's nothing wrong with it. And it's great that classics exist and everything else. It's all great. But if we're going to build and invest in the future, it has to be through the telling of new stories and finding new ways to engage with stuff. So I'm always interested in anything that is sort of nascent, so to speak. And being able to work with Jake early on with this, we were able to go through a workshopping process with it last year in London. And then there was also a kind of developmental stage in San Francisco where we did a version of it. And that involved rewrites and engaging with Jake on the structure of the play and the language of the play and the characters in the play. And so as a director, the more that process is one that is open with a writer and ongoing and mutable and alive, the more interesting it is for me. And I think that, very rarely really do works of art get created by someone just, it's an idea really that the public has in their imagination, that Mozart shut himself in a toilet and wrote Marriage of Figaro, but they didn't. They fandied around for ages, for months, doing drafts, trying a thing out, having a go, workshopping bits. So many Shakespeare's plays, Burbage was making up most of the comedy stuff. They just would have improved it, and then someone wrote it down. So these things, it's not really the artist in the garret coming and go thwack with a finished thing. It's actually how one creates is through a process of iteration and development. And that's been great to work on Jake with that because he's very open, actually. He's very clear about things that are important to him or that he needs or blah, blah, blah. But he's very, very open and generous in response to me kind of going, we need to look at that. And that's a great process. And so I'd say that one of the things that's been excellent about him as a colleague is his willingness to step back and then look at what's on the page and go, how will that appear to an audience? Because that's a constant dialogue, isn't it? You don't kind of patronize an audience, and nor do you spend the whole time wondering or panicking about whether they'll enjoy it. It's not that. It's about what is the story that's going to communicate, and is that the thing I want to communicate?
And for those who don't know the story, tell us the main story arc and the characters in this play.
The main story arc really is about Anne Adams and her husband, Robert. And they were living in Vancouver. She's British originally, but living in Vancouver, he did town planning insofar as he worked in the kind of town planning department and was also a professor of maths. Mostly. Sorry, he didn't work in the town. I get confused about that. He was a professor of maths who was given a task by the town planning department, and she was a biologist. And prior to the play, their son had a bad road accident and was sort of out of action, so to speak, and needed to be cared for at home for a substantial amount of time. And Anne took over the majority of that care. And while she was doing that, she was painting. I think she'd painted anyway, actually, for quite a long time. But what we learn in the play that she's painting, and her son recovers. We don't see the son in the play, but we learn that the son has recovered. And she carried on painting. In the beginning of the play, she's turning around to her husband and going, look, I've decided that I'm not going to go back to the university and carry on being a biologist. I'm going to paint. And he goes, well, that's a rubbish idea because you're a crap painter. So why would you do that? It's like, it's a really bad idea. It's not like you're a good painter. And she goes, but it's what I need to do. And so we see this decision made where she's going to stop and she's going to paint. Mostly until then, she'd painted strawberries in various different guises. And we then find that she has been looking for new things to paint or inspirations, and she listens to Ravel's Bolero and forms a kind of instant connection with Ravel's Bolero and some elements of Ravel's world with Iber Rubinstein, who was a dancer who commissioned the piece, and she starts to sort of dip into this world. And at the same time as she then becomes obsessed with Bolero and starts to paint this piece of work, there's certain behavioral changes that we observe in her, shifts in her kind of speaking register and language that she uses, some changes in emotional behavior that aren't too disturbing at first. And her husband is kind of like, okay, we're doing this now, it's going to be like this, okay. But gradually these become more significant as the play goes on. And she paints a transmodal rather than synesthetic painting of Ravel's Bolero, bar, 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 a kind of version of this thing. She does this painting. And at the same time, in the play, in a kind of not so much a dream space, but kind of an imagined space, she's meeting with Ravel and having conversations with him across time. So Ravel becomes a character in the play that she has these conversations with. Cut to the long and the short. She goes on painting, goes on having conversations with Ravel, starts to exhibit language difficulties. And at the same time, we learn through flashback scenes that Ravel also had language difficulties and similar problems to Anne. And what we learn over the course of the play is that Anne has this frontotemporal lobe dementia, which is the same thing that Ravel died of. And in fact, she paints the painting of Bolero at a similar stage in her disease, from which he then composed the music. So there's this kind of across a century, there's these two people kind of connecting in a kind of response to a disease process in their brain that then triggers a certain simpatico, I guess, across time. And so we go through the path of Anne's illness, and there's another character, Bruce, who is the neuroscientist, who then who got connected to Bruce Miller. She went to work with him during her illness, where he was then, it's the early 90s, mid 90s. So he was doing brain scans and MRIs, and they were looking at her deterioration in her frontal lobes, which is to be expected. But what he noticed was that there was actually a growth in the part of her brain connected to vision and visual processing. And so what happens is she finds a trajectory in her art where she got better at it. From her relatively rudimentary beginnings, she goes into quite expressive art, quite complex ideas, and then through in another stage, she hits a kind of photorealistic period where she paints pebbles in a bowl that really looks like a photograph. She paints a migraine that she has. She does a big painting, which is a kind of study of the number pi. And we can chart you can make a kind of connection between the development of her art and the progress of the disease. So she kind of actually grows in an ability, and her part of her brain was actually growing at the same time as another part was suffering damage. And so where we'd understood about neuroplasticity in the 90s, well, I studied psychology in the 90s, we knew neuroplasticity, we knew that this is a brain's ability to reroute networks when one's damaged. What we weren't so clear about was actually your brain could grow neurons and grow new networks. And this then became a trigger for Bruce Miller to do a long-term study into early signifiers of dementia, which it's been found, not in every case at all, but in a number of cases, a sudden development in linguistic ability, artistic ability, musical ability can be a very, very early sign of changes in the brain associated with dementia. And this could be used as a very early tool for diagnosis. And not only that, but it's also extraordinary reflection of the complexity and mutability of the brain. And so the play goes on and loses function gradually over time. And we parallel that with Ravel's journey. And then at the end, we come to a point where she's died and we're at the eulogy given by our husband, Robert. But the kind of course of the play, in terms of being a journey of watching someone with a disease, go through that process, is quite known in terms of, there's been a lot of movies and plays based on that sort of shape. But what's interesting is the parallel journey that Ravel's going on. And also, it became clear when we were rehearsing it actually back in May, how much really it's also a play about Robert. It's really, really a play about the carer and that journey for the person who's seeing the person they love disappear in one level in front of them. And so it's a complex piece because it's got all of those different dynamics to explore, and yet it's not without hope. It's not actually something where you're just meant to sort of cry at the end and go, oh, isn't it awful, poor woman. There's a lot of the science inside it. It's actually really hopeful, very exploratory, very engaging, and important.
And would you like to talk about the actors who are bringing this play to life with you?
So we have a great group of actors, actually. Andrew playing Robert, Lucy playing Anne, Dex playing Bruce, and Tracey playing Ida Rubinstein, and also this fantastic character of Carol, who Jake based on a person he worked with and met in a care group. And then Leo, who plays Ravel. And we spent 3 weeks together back in May working on the play. And they're very detailed. They're very brave, because whenever you make a very new piece of work, you have to be brave. And also the way that we've been wanting to work on the play is not necessarily, as I was saying earlier about the kind of things that interest me in theatre, it's really not real at all. It's quite expressionistic in some ways, or it's quite exploratory in some ways. We were really clear also early on that music needed to exist and live within the play. So there's a group of musicians that are around the edge of the space, the platform, and a brilliant composer, Mark Gray. And we've got fantastic musicians who are just brilliant and so up for it. And so at times they're responding to and improvising music according to what they look at. Sometimes Mark has written music for them, which can be threads of Ravel that's teased into new musical structures. He's written some brand new music. Sometimes they come up into the space and play on the stage with the actors or cross through. And this kind of fluid flexibility between the kind of musical language of the play, the movement. We're working with a great movement director called Sydney Affendale Phillips that I know from the UK, who's now based in Vancouver. She's been working with all of us on a kind of movement language to explore, so that the audience is watching not just a kind of spoken play, but actually a piece of work that's using imagination and music and language and bodies to kind of explore the story and experience of this woman.
My next question is, tell us about the audio video effects that's helping this story. They're almost like extra characters in UnRavelled.
So I was really clear at the beginning that although movies have a long tradition of watching people with illness be ill and watching people who are at various stages of different things, going through physical challenges or mental challenges, that if you do that on stage, if you're not quite careful, you're just watching someone doing an impression of someone being ill. And what we wanted to do was, rather than do that, was to try to explore the experience of it, which is very different, really. So it's sort of more than just watching people going through the kind of beats of that process, was both for Robert and for Anne as what's it like to be inside that process. And in order to do that, you have to make the audience not observe the thing, but experience it. Does that make sense? And so that can be to be disoriented. It can be to not be sure what you're looking at. It can be to feel stuck. It can be to be in a world where all language is gone and there's just sound and noise, and processing is difficult. So it's this thing about exploring experience rather than showing things. And video was always going to be part of this, partly because Jake had been so excited watching the Ravel that I worked on in San Francisco. But we can play with kind of experience and reality in it. So the video designer Adam Larson's brilliant and has very, very wide-ranging experience. And in this, there'll be video content that he's created where he's extending Anne's paintings. So when she's painting, she did these little circular paintings. She made a book, an A to Z of sort of creatures, alphabet. And she sort of painted these very beautiful kind of radial circular paintings at a time in her disease process where she was very, very obsessed with symmetry. And what we can do is, rather than have anybody Anne miming painting or giving her a canvas, she just stands in the middle of the space, and as she moves, the video paints the painting all around her and across all the surface, up the walls, across the floor. So she's sort of dancing a painting into being, if that makes sense. Because that's probably more how it feels to paint a painting than to watch someone on stage pretending to paint with a paintbrush, sticking it on a piece of canvas and kind of going, now I'm painting, when they're not. It's actually that sense of liberation, that sense of flow, actually is probably what it felt like to paint. So I'd rather explore that and give the audience that, and then create some music that goes with that has a similar quality. So you're looking at the paintings, exploring that, thinking about how they would feel in music, creating that music, and then letting Sid and Lucy work together to find that in Lucy's body. That becomes interesting to me, because then you're really looking at how does it feel to paint if you're a painter, and how would it feel to be that woman who was losing language but still had this fluidity in painting.
Is it easy or more difficult to create a play with dealing with real people and historical characters?
Creating a play dealing with real people or historical characters is, in some ways, you get a leg up because there's a kind of foundation that you can stand on, because there's stuff you can research, you can look at this. In another way, you've got to make decisions about how you create drama, because the trajectory of someone's life is not dramatic. It's just the trajectory of someone's life. Facts are not dramatic. They're just facts. And so you don't create drama by just showing people a bunch of stuff. And so then the drama actually exists in friction between people, or people's internal friction with themselves, or being presented with two terrible choices and having to make one of them. Well, I just made a ballet now with a brilliant French choreographer, Sophie Laplan, and we premiered it, Scottish ballet. We premiered it at the Edinburgh International Festival, and that was all about Mary Queen of Scots. So of course you can go through the beats of her life, but it doesn't make it interesting to watch. That's just you might as well read a history book. That's fine, but why on earth do I have to watch that on stage? So when you're engaging with real people's lives, you have to not get caught in the trap of being so fascinated by their life that you think anyone else is going to give a damn, because that's not enough. And also you have to, I kept saying to Jake, oh dear, poor man. I was using more explicit language in this because I'm English, but I was saying you have to allow us to create people who are awful. Although Anne was a lovely person, and Bruce is a lovely person, and Robert was a good person, lovely. You can't just show a bunch of lovely people for an hour and a half being nice to each other in a difficult situation. It's just incredibly tedious. It's not drama. You've got to allow people to behave very badly in a way that they didn't in life. I'm not saying they did do that, but to create drama out of it, you've got to create problems. And people have to look at their problems and then be faced with them and then try to deal with them. I don't know. So that's the thing that you have to be careful not to. Of course, you don't want to do stuff that's then going to offend, Robert's still alive, Bruce is still alive. You don't want to do stuff that's going to offend them, but they're not the people in the play. The people in the play need to be the characters that the audience is going to engage with, and they have to behave in ways that the people in real life didn't.
What do you want the audience to get out of this play?
I would like the audience to get different things out of the play. I guess, in a way, it's interesting actually going to watch plays with friends or whatever, because I think I'm quite a horrible audience member. I really like things that I think I'm not going to, and often things I think I'm going to like, I don't. So what I'm trying to say is I can go to watch a play with 4 people and we'll all get different things. It's one of the things that's interesting about a play. Do you know, if you look at the art of Yves Klein, I made a film about him. He did those very, very beautiful paintings that were often just blue. everybody's going to take a very different thing, because the question, the piece itself, Eveline's painting, doesn't give you any answers. It just gives you questions. And then it's up to you to deal with that as you will. So in a way, I think the play needs to make us ask questions and not give answers to them. So if you go away and it makes you think about the way your brain, what an extraordinary thing it is, the brain, and how unknowable it is still. We have really clueless, and yet fascinating it is. If it makes you go away and you think about the importance and strength of relationships, and how in appalling times people kind of find their way to each other, or if it makes you think about identity, personal identity, what is it to be a person? Where does personhood consist? Is it in the ability to communicate? Is it not? Is it in? These are quite interesting questions that the play raises up, although sometimes quite quickly you can kind of waft off into kind of philosophical ideas and existential ideas and psychological ideas. So I think at an emotional level, I think you sort of want people to walk away with a sense of wonder.
And why is this play such a relatable play for today's audiences?
The play is relatable for a modern audience because it speaks to, on different levels, I think it speaks to family and relationships, and how, as we grow older and change, those relationships change and tensions can come to bear on them. And I think that's the case whatever's happening in your life, whether you get something like dementia or you don't. That those things, as we change as people, our relationships shift. And so this is, in a way, puts a very sharp point on that, because Anne changes very dramatically, and how Robert has to negotiate her change. Yeah, so I think that's relatable to all of us. And then I think in the 70s, everyone was terrified of cancer and didn't like to speak about it. I remember the C word, and even in the 80s, there's a kind of, people hid from it. I think in the 90s, people did that with dementia and Alzheimer's. It was just terrifying. It was too frightening a thing to speak about. And I think now there's a fair bit of work now coming up creatively in theatre and film, dealing with dementia and dealing with Alzheimer's in a way that didn't take place 15, 20 years ago. So I think people are looking to learn more about it. Modern audiences are. I don't think we have solutions to those diseases yet, and therefore they remain a kind of terrifying thing to people. But I think if you look at, I don't know, I think it's talked about in a way it wouldn't have been. If you think of the publicity given to Bruce Willis's illness, that just wouldn't have been talked about even 10 years ago. It just would have gone quiet. Instead, now people talk about it. People are addressing it, about how he is and the course of his illness and how he's getting on. And I think so. These plays that speak to that are important, because they're part of how plays can only be a reflection of the culture and society they're being born from. And so these are being made because the society itself is asking these questions and looking at these things, and is in a place where it's wanting to sort of think about them. And so I think it makes it relatable on a personal level, but it's also relatable on a kind of subject level, because I think it is becoming something that people are wanting to know more about.
Tell us why the Wallis Annenberg Center for Performing Arts in Beverly Hills would be a unique theater to see this new play.
The theatre itself, the Wallis, is a very lovely sized space for a piece of work like this. I think it's got the resources to be able to deliver some of the technical things that we're wanting to do in terms of projection, and the music space has got very good acoustic, and it's big enough to kind of deliver those things, and yet it remains very intimate. So I think the connection between the audience and the stage will be very direct, and that for me is really important. I think a piece like this in a kind of barn of a theatre, you lose the intimacy and you lose the proximity to the story. So hopefully it's going to allow us to deliver image on a scale that we need, so that sometimes Anne can feel very small in a very big space, and yet there's going to be a kind of closeness between the audience and the storytelling that enables them to feel like they're inside it rather than looking at something from quite far away.
Is there anything else about the production that we haven't covered that you want to mention?
I think it's interesting to consider how the design and costume function within the piece, that we've gone for a design element from this brilliant designer Emma Kingsbury of the set, which is quite very simple and in some ways abstract and austere. It's a platform with a rake and then a ceiling above it that can shift and move. And the floor itself is a kind of pale grey, and so is the wall. And this feels like not grey because the brain is grey, but the interior of Anne's mind. So things can emerge up out of the floor and disappear into the floor, almost like the surface of memory. And the projections can appear on the wall and on the floor. You can be inside the whole surface of it. And I think that allows for a kind of fluidity in storytelling and almost like a dreamlike quality when we want it. That I think is really important. So it's this idea of it's not going to look like someone's sitting room. Actually, you're inside a space that itself will change in front of your own eyes. And the costumes as well, we've gone with this idea of layering and transparency. So Anne's costumes are sometimes made of several transparent layers, like memory, so that you're not really in a realistic landscape. You're sort of going back through someone's memory and imagination. And so there's this idea of layering in the costumes and a kind of space in terms of the room that can change and kind of pull itself out of the floor in front of your own eyes is a really interesting thing, I think.
And the most important question, why must the viewers attend the world premiere of the play UnRavelled by Jake Broder?
The audience should come and see the premiere of this play because it is touching, as I mentioned earlier, on a thing that now concerns all of us, I think. I think when we first came together, the producer, Cath, Brittan, who's incredibly brilliant person, and Jake and Lucy and me and some of the other actors, there wasn't a single one of us who didn't have someone in our family that had some connection to not necessarily frontotemporal lobe dementia, but some form of Alzheimer's or another form of dementia. It's a story that it's very universal. I think it's maybe partly because so many of us are living longer that it's becoming more recognizable, that we are talking about it more. And so a new play that addresses this with hope, with engagement, that involves an extraordinary story of this woman and her response to the challenge that came upon her, and the way that the art came from her, the way that connects to Ravel, and this sort of connection across time is an extraordinary thing. And the chance to see that combined with a kind of visual language of storytelling and music, we hope will give a kind of unique experience to the audience, which should be very sort of complete, if that makes sense, gestalt, because it's actually coming at visually as she did. We use the sound language as a kind of transmodal version as well, so the audience themselves are in the kind of space that Anne was in.
Why is it important to always support new play productions and creative playwrights like Jake?
So if you have a garden or a field and all you ever do is grow the things that have always been in the soil, over time the soil gets thinner and depleted because the nutrients of those plants that you keep growing in the same plants in the same soil, it depletes the nutrients of the plants themselves over time, get more fragile and weaker. And in the end, you'll have a garden with lots of wilting, thin, uninspiring flowers. The thing you need to do is change your crop. You need to put in new plants into the soil, plants that will take different nutrients and put other ones back in. And it's fundamental to any ecosystem, this ability to regenerate not an existing thing, but to create new things, because they put back into the system in a different way. They feed the system in a different way. It's a complex thing. And it's the same with drama and theatre. If all we do is keep growing the same crop over and over again, over time, that soil is going to get thinner and thinner and thinner. And yet the soil is the thing that we create the art from. So it's fundamental that we support new writers. It's fundamental that we support new plays, because that is like putting a new seed into that ground and growing a new plant. And that's the way that you end up with a kind of healthy ecosystem. It's no good doing a monoculture. We all know what happens to the fields if you just plant soybeans. And so it's really, really important, really. I'm kind of slightly pushing my analogy, but I'll go for it. It's really important that we allow that to take place, so we end up with something which is both diverse and has depth. And so each new play is important. It doesn't matter if it plays good or rubbish. It's important to invest in supporting it, because it's only through having a breadth of new plays that you get the possibility of the extraordinary.
And to add to that, as you know, ticket sales for a theater production doesn't cover everything anytime in any production. Why is it important for the local communities to not only go and see the productions, but also maybe donate to their local theaters, allow it to continue to grow the garden?
The donation element of theatre is vital because theatre is a costly business, but also you only get the reward via the risk. So if theatre becomes only premised or predicated on financial return, you skew the lens that you're looking through, because everything becomes not about, is this an important story to tell? Is this an audit? It's just about return bang for your buck in terms of the producer or in terms of the thing making money. That doesn't mean that theatre can't make money. It can, it does, it's great when it does. But if the only goal is making money, in a way, the system itself becomes very cynical. And you only have to look at what people at the moment or the last few years have been saying about Hollywood or Hollywood writing or where that's at, where they're going, actually that ground's got quite thin because it's just, you're recycling another movie for the 13th iteration of its thing rather than actually new ideas. And so to support a theatre in your area, to support new work at that theatre, you're actually fundamentally contributing to how the system itself operates. And we only have the great plays of yesteryear because of donations and people supporting the arts and people investing in them with both their time and their care and their money. That's how they grew. It's how it happened. And so unless we do that, unless we make that effort to participate and to actively support things, then yeah, they won't exist. And what you'll end up with is something that just wants to deliver a product that's going to bang out its maximal return, which is fine. You get a thing that functions perfectly well like that, but go and eat fast food and tell me it's the best food you ever ate in the world.
When did you fall in love with directing, and when did it go from an interest to an obsession?
I think, well, the question of when did I fall in love with directing, it actually grew quite slowly because I trained rather as an actor and I was still acting. And then I was sitting in a cafe in London in the rain, and I'd been out in New Mexico, up in Taos and Santa Fe, tutoring family, working with the family with this kid. And I loved living there. It was very beautiful. And I'd been to the opera in Santa Fe a couple of times. And I come back to London, I was sitting in the rain, reading the Observer magazine on a Sunday, and it was an article about this theatre director, Jonathan Kent, who used to run the Almeida Theatre in London. And he was one of the first people back in the 90s that sort of, it happened before, but he started a new wave of famous people coming over. So Kevin Spacey, and Kate Blanchett and Juliette Binoche, he cast them in shows and then did them. And so he was very kind of much in vogue. And I had just seen a King Lear he'd done. It was amazing. Anyway, I was sitting in the rain reading this article about he was going to Santa Fe to work on the first opera he'd ever worked on, a Janacek opera, Kasia Kabanova, which comes from an Ostrowski play, The Storm. So it's not in terms of pieces of opera, it's very much like a play. It doesn't have a sort of formal structure like Baroque opera or 18th century opera, and it's not as romantic as 19th century opera. Janacek really took plays and then set them to music. Anyway, and I was reading this article about he was going to Santa Fe and he'd never been there and he'd never worked on an opera. So I just wrote him a letter. It was pre-email. I handwrote a letter and said, look, I've just come back from Santa Fe and I'm sitting in London and the weather's rubbish. I'd much rather be back in Santa Fe. I don't like opera, but I know music. I'm a pianist and I could, I'm an actor. Maybe I'll come with you. And I didn't hear anything for like 8 months. And then his PA wrote to me, again, handwritten letter saying, if you were serious, you could meet Jonathan for a coffee. And so I met him for coffee and we've gotten really well. And I ended up going to Santa Fe with him and working on this opera. And in the opera, there's a singer in the US called Patricia Rosset, who's an amazing actor. And she could really act and sing. And that was the first time I'd ever, in terms of opera, kind of gone, oh, wow, there's a whole world here that could be really interesting. And so I became interested in that. For quite a long time, I didn't really direct actors, partly because I think it would have been quite difficult for me because I am an actor. And I think being an actor is like being an alcoholic. You never give it up. You're still an actor even when you're not acting. It's like a way of life. And I think I would have been it would have been awkward, I think, because I'd have still wanted to be doing what they were doing. And so actually working music and in opera had enough distance from I couldn't do what they were doing. Do you see what I mean? So I could help facilitate all of that. And then over time, I've ended up doing plays and musicals, and now I work a lot with dance. Actually, I work a lot on kind of ballets, creating new ballets from scratch, creating the story, working with composers to write new music. So now I would say I'm right across all four. There's still theatre actually, but just different forms of theatre.
I'm actually adding this question. What is your favorite thing about directing a play or musical or opera?
My favorite thing about directing a play or musical or opera is actually the collaboration, because I think theatre is essentially a collaborative act. Even when you go to the theatre to watch, or when you're an actor on stage, you are in collaboration with an audience. You're making an agreement. It's an act of agreement that you're going to engage with one another and tell a story, and they're going to attend to the story you're telling. And then how you play with that and how you explore that together is in itself collaborative. So theatre is essentially collaborative, but then making work with groups of people, where I would say the average project I work on is 2 or 3 years to make, probably. I'm now sort of starting to do ones for 2028. And they take a long time frame, and the actors or the singers may come in the last 5 weeks. But up until then, you're working with designers, with composers, with writers, and that this idea that actually one creates in the end a product that's come from no one in particular, but emerges from a group of people in a specific period of time, socio-political time or cultural time, that is a response to a provocation. Sometimes it's an idea, sometimes it's a story, sometimes it's a novel. You're responding to something, and together this group of people produce a thing, and then by engaging with the performers, they then add another set of things to that piece. That the act of collaboration is what's interesting, because what emerges has its own identity that's bigger, both bigger and can be more dynamic than any one person's point of view. And I think that's really interesting, the way that the work itself emerges from the group. And so the sort of work I like to make, of the working environment I prefer to work in, is actually sort of very horizontal. So it's got to be clear, you need some structure, because someone's got to make decisions, be accountable and kind of go, well, we'll do this, this, and this. But actually, the more horizontal it is, the more space there is for people to contribute ideas and have thoughts. And then you're editing those. I don't believe in a world where everything's great and everything's brilliant and everyone's marvelous. Like, we can all be rubbish. I can have good ideas and really rubbish ones. It's fine. I don't care. It's fine to have a rubbish idea. It doesn't matter. It's not a problem. So you've got to create a space where everyone's okay to try everything, even when it's awful. And when it's awful, we all laugh and go, oh my God, how hilarious. That was awful. It's not a problem. Then I think that I find that very rewarding.
The theater experience, why is it such a unique format for both the actors and the live audience?
So the unique thing about theatre, in terms of storytelling, although the kind of form of theatre is just unbelievably ancient, isn't it? It happens in every culture, in every society. There's forms of storytelling. Theatre remains, as I was saying earlier, a collaborative game, so that the act of engagement by the audience changes the thing they're looking into. They're not passive, they're active within the space and the stage. So the show itself changes depending on the audience. You're not delivering a product that is a consistent thing that just arrives on a plate and then you consume it as an audience. The audience is actually engaged with it as it happens, and their engagement changes it. I guess the most extreme version of it would be a stand-up comedian. The gig of a stand-up comedian is fundamentally changed by the audience, the hecklers, the way they interact with them. They'll suddenly turn a corner and tell a joke they hadn't planned to tell. And so a different, slighter form of that happens in every performance on stage. As an actor, you can feel the audience and you respond to that. You stretch a moment or you speed up a moment, and the audience may laugh in one place or respond in another. And so to understand that negotiation between audience and stage is active and connected is really important, and to attend to it, and to know where you ask the audience to engage in a particular way. So that a lot of the theatre that I'm quite interested in at the minute is ones where you don't pretend what they're looking at is real, because that's a ridiculous thing to do, because they're sitting in a very uncomfortable seat in a theatre, so they know it's not real. It's no point. Why would you do that? In a way, it's kind of Brechtian, but it's just daft. Of course it's not real. They can see the light. They know they're in a theatre. They're not idiots. Instead, what you do is you play an imaginative game with them and you go, okay, let's do this. It's just the same. adults are only children in big clothes. So when you're little and you play a kid, play a child, play games as a child, one kind of goes, oh yeah, look, there's a blah, blah, blah come falling out of the tree, and they may make up the name of a monster, and then you all go along and you play that game. And you go, oh, okay, and then you establish a set of rules, and then you play according to those rules. And if, as a director, you're clear with the audience about the set of rules you're establishing, audiences are generally very good and very generous about going along with you. And the more that you ask them to make a jump in the way that you're engaging with them, the more they commit. So the most tedious thing you can do in theatre is pretend, A, that it's real, because it's just daft, and B, just ask them to passively watch something. So I work with the puppeteers who made Warhorse back in the UK on another show for like a year, for a long time. And they were really clear that, when they work with puppets, a Handspring puppet company, they never hide the puppeteer. You can see the puppeteer moving it. You don't pretend. You see it all the time. But then the movement of the puppet is so believable that you're caught in this trap where you go, oh God, that looks real. Oh my God, it looks like the horse is breathing. But you can see the person in the horse moving its head. And that sort of tension between the fact that you can see it's not real, but it's behaving as if it is, the audience then makes an emotional commitment, which is much greater than if you just are pretending that what they're looking at is like a movie set, but they happen to be looking at the reality. That imaginative engagement then triggers an emotional response.
To add to that, why is it worth, if you see the play at the beginning or the production at the beginning of the run, why is it worth seeing it later?
So during the course of a run, a play can change very substantially, because the play exists, of course, if Jake was here, a play exists in the words, but it also exists between the words. And a play exists in the actors' performances, but it also exists in the space between the actors. And so those things develop and shift and morph. There may not be words added. There may not be actors added. But those other things are very mutable, and they change every night. A director, when I was at drama school, said a thing to me that I liked it. He said, look, any one night, there's a set of stepping stones you have to step on in order for the storytelling to be clear and the scene to be fulfilled. So if someone's going to die of eating a poisoned apple, they've got to get hold of the apple and then they've got to eat it. But the way you go between the stepping stones is different every night, and should be different every night. It can't be the same. And so often during a run, the stepping stones themselves also shift, because the play itself finds a room to breathe. It starts to understand what it is. The actors start to understand how to take an audience on the journey through the play, the shape of it, which when you haven't done it before is really unknown. And that takes time to kind of find out how to form that. And so, between the beginning of a run and the end of a run, a play can change substantially. So my name's James Bonas. I'm the director of UnRavelled, which is a new play by Jake Broder. It's going to be at the Wallis in October. And it's an extraordinary piece that explores a woman's relationships, her family dynamics, her battle with a disease that in the end takes her life, but an incredible thing that happened where she responded, and her own brain responded to that disease with an outburst of incredible creativity. And so the play has an emotional, bang, but alongside it, it's a world of scientific discovery and learning about dementia, which is an incredible opportunity to take part in, both as a creative of the show, but also as an audience member. So I say get a ticket, and we'll see you at the theatre.